Hello, and welcome to the Sleepy History Channel After Dark. Tonight, we're drifting off into the history of the founding of the United States, 250th anniversary in 2026. Let's dive in. In the year 1776, something extraordinary happened along the eastern coast of North America. 13 colonies, stretching from the forests of New Hampshire to the Carolina coastlands, came together to declare themselves a new nation. But this moment didn't emerge from nowhere. The story of America's founding began decades earlier, across an ocean, in the hearts and minds of people who could scarcely imagine what they would create. Our story begins in the 1760s, when most colonists still considered themselves loyal British subjects. They lived under the rule of King George III, a monarch who sat on his throne 3,000 miles away in London. For generations, these colonies had enjoyed what historians call salutary neglect. Britain had largely left them to govern themselves, focused as it was on wars in Europe and managing its vast empire. The colonists had grown accustomed to this freedom. But everything changed after 1763. When Britain emerged victorious from the 7 Years' War, known in the colonies as the French and Indian War. The war had been staggeringly expensive, doubling Britain's national debt to over £130 million. British officials looked across the Atlantic and saw their American colonies, which had benefited from British military protection, and decided it was time these colonists helped pay for their own defense. In 1765, Parliament passed the Stamp Act, requiring colonists to purchase special stamp paper for legal documents, newspapers, and even playing cards. It was the first direct tax Britain had ever imposed on the colonies. The reaction was immediate and fierce. In towns from Boston to Charleston, crowds gathered in protest. They weren't angry simply about the money. The principle cut deeper. These colonists elected their own local assemblies, yet they had no representatives in Parliament. No taxation without representation became their rallying cry, a phrase that would echo through history. The Stamp Act was repealed within a year, but Britain's Parliament wasn't finished. In 1767, they passed the Townshend Acts, placing duties on imported goods like tea, glass, and paper. Once again, the colonies erupted in protest. Merchants organized boycotts. Women gathered in spinning circles, creating homespun cloth rather than buying British fabric. What had begun as scattered complaints was transforming into something larger, a shared colonial identity. On a cold March evening in 1770, tensions that had been building in Boston finally exploded. British soldiers, harassed by a crowd throwing snowballs and rocks, fired into the mob. 5 colonists laid dead in the snow, including Crispus Attucks, a man of African and Native American descent who would become known as the first casualty of the American Revolution. The Boston Massacre, as Patriot leaders called it, became a rallying point, proof to many colonists that British rule had become tyrannical. For the next few years, an uneasy peace held. But in 1773, Parliament made a fateful decision. To help the struggling British East India Company, they granted it a monopoly on tea sales in America. On the night of December 16th, colonists disguised as Mohawk warriors boarded 3 ships in Boston Harbor and dumped 342 chests of tea, worth nearly £10,000, into the dark waters. The Boston Tea Party was both a protest and a point of no return. Britain's response was swift and harsh. Parliament passed what colonists called the Intolerable Acts, closing Boston's port until the tea was paid for and stripping Massachusetts of much of its self-governance. British General Thomas Gage arrived with 4 regiments of soldiers. To enforce order, Britain was now willing to use military occupation. But instead of cowering, the colonies drew together. In September 1774, delegates from 12 colonies met in Philadelphia for the First Continental Congress. They weren't revolutionaries yet. Most still hoped for reconciliation, but they agreed to support Massachusetts, to organize a complete boycott of British goods, and perhaps most significantly, to meet again if their grievances weren't addressed. Colonial unity, once unthinkable, was becoming reality. As 1775 dawned, two futures stood before the American colonies. One path led to reconciliation, to remaining part of the British Empire as reformed, respected subjects. The other led into unknown territory, toward independence, toward war, toward the possibility of creating something the world had never quite seen before. The choice, though few realized it yet, had already been made. On April 19, 1775, that choice would become clear in the Massachusetts countryside, where farmers and merchants would face the most powerful military in the world, and where the first shots of the American Revolution would ring out across Lexington Green. This is where our story truly begins, not with the signing of a declaration, but with ordinary people making an extraordinary choice. The story of how America was founded is not just a story of great men in powdered wigs. It's the story of a people discovering they could govern themselves and deciding that freedom was worth whatever price they might have to pay. The morning of April 19, 1775, began in darkness. British General Thomas Gage had received orders to seize military supplies the colonists had been stockpiling in Concord, Massachusetts. But the colonists had their own network of intelligence. As 700 British regulars marched out of Boston under cover of night, riders galloped ahead to spread the alarm. Paul Revere, William Dawes, and Samuel Prescott rode through the countryside, warning that the regulars were coming. By dawn, about 70 colonial militiamen had gathered on Lexington Green, blocking the road to Concord. These were farmers and tradesmen, not professional soldiers. Their leader, Captain John Parker, had fought in the French and Indian War, and he knew the odds they faced. As the sun rose and the British column appeared, redcoats gleaming in the morning light, Parker reportedly told his men, "Stand your ground. Don't fire unless fired upon. But if they mean to have a war, let it begin here." What happened next remains one of history's mysteries. Someone fired a shot. The shot heard round the world, though no one could ever say with certainty who pulled the trigger. Then came a volley from the British line. When the smoke cleared, 8 colonists lay dead on the green, and 10 more were wounded. The British regulars marched on to Concord. At Concord's North Bridge, the British found and destroyed what few military supplies remained. But by now, the countryside was swarming with militia. At the bridge, colonial forces outnumbered the British for the first time that day. When the British fired, the colonists fired back in earnest. The British began to retreat. That retreat became a nightmare. All along the 16-mile road back to Boston, militiamen fired from behind stone walls, from windows, from every available cover. The British regulars, trained to fight in organized formations on open battlefields, were devastated by this guerrilla warfare. By the time they reached the safety of Boston, the British had suffered 273 casualties, killed, wounded, or missing. The colonists had lost 95 men. The war had begun. News of Lexington and Concord spread through the colonies like wildfire. Within days, thousands of militiamen from throughout New England converged on Boston, laying siege to the city. The Second Continental Congress convened in Philadelphia on May 10, 1775, just 3 weeks after the battle. The delegates faced an impossible situation. They were fighting a war, yet most still hoped to avoid complete separation from Britain. They needed leadership, and they needed unity between the colonies. On June 15th, Congress made a decision that would prove crucial to the Revolution's success. They appointed George Washington of Virginia as commander-in-chief of what they now called the Continental Army. Washington was not the most brilliant military tactician, but he possessed something more valuable: unshakable integrity and the respect of both Northerners and Southerners. He accepted the command reluctantly, refusing any salary except for expenses, and left Philadelphia for Boston. He arrived to find his army besieging the British from the high ground surrounding the city. On June 17th, before Washington reached Boston, one of the war's bloodiest battles had already been fought. The Battle of Bunker Hill, actually fought on nearby Breed's Hill, saw colonial forces dig in atop the heights overlooking Boston Harbor. The British, determined to dislodge them, launched 3 direct assaults up the hill. The colonists, desperately short on gunpowder, were ordered not to fire until they could see the whites of their eyes. Twice they repulsed the British with devastating volleys. The 3rd assault succeeded only after the colonists ran out of ammunition. The British took the hill, but at a terrible cost: 1,054 casualties out of about 2,400 men engaged. The colonists lost around 450 men, but they had proven something profound: they could stand and fight against professional British soldiers. Through the summer and fall of 1775, the contradiction deepened. The colonies were at war with Britain, yet most colonists still professed loyalty to King George III. They blamed Parliament, blamed the king's ministers, but not the king himself. They still hoped for reconciliation, for a return to the old relationship they had cherished. That hope died slowly. In August, King George III declared the colonies to be in open rebellion. In December, Parliament passed the American Prohibitory Act, cutting off all trade with the colonies and authorizing the seizure of American ships. Britain was treating the colonies not as wayward subjects to be brought back into the fold, but as enemies to be crushed. Meanwhile, an idea that had once seemed radical was gaining ground. In January 1776, a pamphlet appeared in Philadelphia that would change everything. Written by Thomas Paine, an English immigrant who had arrived in America only 2 years earlier. Common sense made the case for complete independence in language anyone could understand. Paine didn't use philosophical abstractions. He wrote with fire and clarity. Why should a continent be governed by an island? Why should free people bow to hereditary monarchy? Why should Americans settle for mere reform when they could create something entirely new? Common Sense sold 120,000 copies in its first 3 months, an astonishing number in a colonial population of 2.5 million. It circulated from hand to hand, was read aloud in taverns and churches. Paine's words gave voice to a thought many had been afraid to speak. Independence wasn't just possible, it was the only rational path forward. As spring turned to summer in 1776, the Continental Congress began moving toward the inevitable decision. On June 7th, Richard Henry Lee of Virginia introduced a resolution that these united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states. The debate was fierce. Some delegates worried about the consequences of such a bold step. Others insisted the time had come. While Congress debated, they appointed a committee to draft a declaration explaining their reasons to the world. The committee included John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, and a tall, quiet young Virginian named Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson, just 33 years old, was chosen to write the first draft. Over the next 17 days, working in a second-floor room in Philadelphia, Jefferson crafted words that would resonate through the centuries. The declaration he wrote did more than list grievances against King George. It articulated a philosophy, a vision of what government should be. "We hold these truths to be self-evident," Jefferson wrote, "that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." These were radical words in a world of monarchies and inherited privilege. They planted seeds that would grow far beyond anything the founders imagined. Seeds of equality, of human dignity, of the right of people to govern themselves. On July 2nd, 1776, the Continental Congress voted for independence. John Adams wrote to his wife Abigail that this day would be celebrated by succeeding generations as the great anniversary festival. But it was July 4th when Congress approved the final text of Jefferson's Declaration of Independence. That became the date Americans would remember. 56 men signed their names to that document, knowing they were committing treason against the crown, a crime punishable by death. Benjamin Franklin, the oldest signer at 70, reportedly said, "We must all hang together, or most assuredly, we shall all hang separately." The Declaration didn't win the war. It didn't guarantee success. When it was signed, the British controlled New York, and Washington's army was in retreat. The road ahead would be long, brutal, and uncertain. Many who heard the Declaration read aloud in town squares that July would not live to see American independence secured. But something fundamental had changed. The colonists were no longer fighting to restore old rights within the British Empire. They were fighting to create something new, a republic, a nation founded not on the authority of kings, but on the consent of the governed. They had declared to the world that they were Americans now, and there would be no turning back. The summer of 1776 brought both triumph and disaster. While the Declaration of Independence proclaimed American freedom, the reality on the ground told a different story. The British were determined to crush the rebellion quickly, and they assembled the largest expeditionary force they had ever sent across the Atlantic. In late August, over 32,000 British and Hessian troops, German soldiers hired by King George, descended on New York. Washington's Continental Army numbered only about 19,000 men, many of them poorly trained militia. On August 27th, at the Battle of Long Island, the British executed a brilliant flanking maneuver, nearly surrounding the American forces. Washington lost over 1,000 men killed, wounded, or captured. It was a devastating defeat, but Washington proved his worth not in victory, but in a daring retreat. On the foggy night of August 29th, he evacuated his entire army across the East River to Manhattan, using every available boat. The British awoke to find their prey had vanished. It wouldn't be the last time Washington's greatest skill, knowing when to retreat and preserve his army, would save the American cause. Through the fall of 1776, the pattern continued. Washington retreated from Manhattan, retreated across New Jersey, retreated across the Delaware River into Pennsylvania. By December, his army was melting away. Enlistments were expiring, men were deserting, and those who remained were hungry, poorly clothed, and demoralized. The revolution seemed on the verge of collapse. Thomas Paine, who had marched with the army, wrote another pamphlet in those dark days. "These are the times that try men's souls," he began. "The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will, in this crisis, shrink from the service of their country, but he that stands by it now deserves the love and thanks of man and woman." Washington knew he needed a victory, something to restore hope and convince his soldiers to stay. On Christmas night, 1776, in a howling winter storm, he made one of the boldest decisions of his military career. He would cross the Delaware River back into New Jersey and attack the Hessian garrison at Trenton. The crossing was treacherous. Ice choked the river. The password that night was victory or death. It took 9 hours to get 2,400 men and artillery across. They marched 9 miles through sleet and snow to reach Trenton at dawn. Some men had no shoes. They wrapped their feet in rags and left bloody footprints in the snow. The attack was a complete surprise. The Hessians, recovering from Christmas celebrations, were overwhelmed. In less than an hour, Washington had captured nearly 900 prisoners and killed or wounded over 100 more. American casualties were minimal, only 4 wounded, and 2 men who froze to death during the march. It wasn't a large battle by European standards, but its impact was enormous. The revolution had been saved. A week later, Washington struck again at Princeton, routing British forces and capturing supplies. These victories transformed the war. Enlistments increased. French observers, who had been watching skeptically, began to think the Americans might actually have a chance. Washington took his army into winter quarters at Morristown, New Jersey, having proven that the Continental Army could fight and win. But winning battles wasn't enough. The Americans needed allies, resources, money, things they desperately lacked. The Continental Congress could print money, but it couldn't tax, and the paper currency they issued, called Continentals, rapidly lost value. Not worth a continental became a common expression for something worthless. More critically, America needed international recognition. As long as the revolution was simply a British internal matter, no European power would openly support the rebels. The Americans needed to prove they could win, and they needed a diplomatic strategy. In France, sentiment was shifting. The French still smarted from their defeat in the 7 Years' War and welcomed any chance to weaken their British rivals. Benjamin Franklin arrived in Paris in December 1776 as America's representative, and he became an unlikely sensation. This 70-year-old printer and scientist, with his simple dress and frontier charm, captivated French society. He embodied what the French imagined America to be, a land of natural virtue and republican simplicity. But the French King Louis XVI was cautious. He would provide secret aid, money, and weapons, but he wouldn't sign a formal alliance until the Americans proved they could achieve major military success. Everything depended on the Continental Army's ability to win a decisive victory. The opportunity came in 1777. British General John Burgoyne launched an ambitious campaign from Canada, planning to march south down the Hudson River Valley and cut New England off from the other colonies. He commanded a force of over 7,000 British regulars, Hessians, Native American allies, and loyalists. The campaign began well, but it would end in disaster. Burgoyne's army moved slowly, hampered by dense forests and American resistance. At Bennington, Vermont, militia wiped out a foraging party of nearly 1,000 men. The British supply lines stretched thin. American forces under General Horatio Gates gathered to block Burgoyne's advance near Saratoga, New York. On September 19th, the two armies clashed at Freeman's Farm. The fighting was fierce and indecisive, but the British suffered heavy casualties they couldn't replace. On October 7th, they attacked again at Bemis Heights. This time, the Americans, led by the aggressive and brilliant Benedict Arnold, counterattacked with devastating effect. Arnold personally led charges that shattered the British line, though he was severely wounded in the leg. Burgoyne found himself surrounded, his army reduced to fewer than 6,000 men, with no hope of reinforcement or escape. On October 17, 1777, he surrendered his entire army to General Gates. Nearly 6,000 British and Hessian soldiers laid down their arms. The greatest American victory of the war. The news of Saratoga changed everything. When word reached Paris in December, the French government made its decision. On February 6, 1778, France signed 2 treaties with the United States, a treaty of amity and commerce, and a treaty of alliance. France officially recognized American independence and committed to fight Britain until that independence was secured. The Americans would no longer face the world's most powerful empire alone. Spain and the Netherlands would eventually join the war against Britain as well. What had begun as a colonial rebellion had become a global conflict, with fighting spreading from North America to the Caribbean, from Europe to India. The balance of power had fundamentally shifted. Yet for the soldiers of the Continental Army, the victory at Saratoga and the French alliance brought little immediate relief. As 1777 turned to 1778, Washington took his army into winter quarters at Valley Forge, Pennsylvania. What followed would become legendary, a winter of suffering that tested whether the revolution could endure. Valley Forge was not a battle, but a trial of endurance. Approximately 12,000 men huddled in crude log huts through one of the coldest winters of the century. They lacked adequate food, clothing, and shelter. Disease ravaged the camp: typhoid, typhus, dysentery, pneumonia. By spring, nearly 2,000 men had died, not from British bullets but from cold, hunger, and sickness. Washington pleaded with Congress and the states for supplies, writing letters that barely concealed his desperation. "Unless some great and capital change suddenly takes place," he wrote, "this army must inevitably be reduced to one or other of these 3 things: starve, dissolve, or disperse." But the army held together. The soldiers' loyalty to Washington, to each other, and to the cause sustained them through the darkest months. And something remarkable happened at Valley Forge that winter. A Prussian military officer named Baron von Steuben arrived in camp and began drilling the troops. Every day, through snow and cold, he taught them to march in formation, to load and fire efficiently, to maneuver as disciplined units. The Continental Army that emerged from Valley Forge in the spring of 1778 was transformed, no longer a collection of militia and volunteers, but a professional fighting force. As spring arrived and the army marched out of Valley Forge, the war entered a new phase. The British, recognizing they couldn't crush the rebellion in the north, would shift their strategy southward. The fighting would spread to Georgia, the Carolinas, and Virginia. There would be more battles, more suffering, more years of war. But something essential had been decided. The Americans had survived the darkest period, had gained a powerful ally, and had forged an army that could stand against British regulars. The revolution that had seemed doomed just a year earlier now had a real chance of success. The question was no longer whether America could survive. The question was how it would win, and what kind of nation would emerge from the fire of war. The arrival of French support in 1778 brought new hope, but it couldn't guarantee victory. The British, recognizing their northern strategy had failed, turned their attention southward. They believed the southern colonies harbored more loyalist sympathy, and that controlling the region's valuable ports and plantations would cripple the American economy. What followed would be some of the war's most brutal fighting. In December 1778, British forces captured Savannah, Georgia. By the spring of 1779, they controlled most of Georgia. In May 1780, they achieved their greatest triumph of the war, the capture of Charleston, South Carolina. General Benjamin Lincoln surrendered his entire army of approximately 5,000 Continental soldiers to British General Henry Clinton. The greatest American defeat of the entire war. The loss was staggering. In one stroke, the Americans had lost an army, hundreds of cannons, and thousands of muskets they desperately needed. The British seemed unstoppable in the south. General Charles Cornwallis took command of British forces in the region and marched into the Carolina interior, confident he could pacify the countryside and restore royal authority. But he was about to discover that conventional military victories didn't translate into political control. The war in the South became a civil war within a war. Neighbor fought neighbor. Loyalist militias clashed with patriot irregulars. The violence was personal and often vicious. At the Battle of Waxhaws on May 29, 1780, British cavalry under Lieutenant Colonel Banastre Tarleton slaughtered Continental soldiers who were trying to surrender, killing 113 and wounding another 150. Tarleton's quarter became a rallying cry for American forces, meaning no mercy would be given. This brutality backfired on the British. Instead of intimidating the population into submission, it ignited resistance. Partisan leaders like Francis Marion, the Swamp Fox, Thomas Sumter, and Andrew Pickens led guerrilla fighters who harassed British supply lines, ambushed isolated detachments, and melted back into the swamps and forests. The British could win battles, but they couldn't control the territory between their forts. Congress sent General Horatio Gates, the victor of Saratoga, south to rebuild American forces. It was a disastrous choice. At the Battle of Camden on August 16, 1780, Gates's army of approximately 4,000 men met Cornwallis's force of similar size. Gates positioned inexperienced militia on his left flank, and when the British attacked, the militia broke and fled. The entire American force disintegrated. Gates himself fled the battlefield so quickly that he rode 80 miles in a single day. The Americans suffered over 2,000 casualties and lost their artillery. Gates's military reputation was destroyed forever. The situation looked desperate. The British controlled Georgia and South Carolina, had shattered 2 American armies, and were poised to invade North Carolina. But then the tide began to turn, starting in the backcountry of the Carolinas. On October 7th, 1780, at Kings Mountain near the border of the Carolinas, 900 Loyalist militia commanded by British Major Patrick Ferguson took position atop a rocky ridge, believing themselves secure. What Ferguson didn't know was that approximately 1,000 frontiersmen, the Over-Mountain men from what is now Tennessee, were closing in on him. These weren't Continental soldiers. They were hunters and farmers who had crossed the mountains when they heard Ferguson was threatening to burn their settlements. They surrounded Kings Mountain and attacked uphill from all sides, using the trees and rocks for cover, fighting the way they hunted, taking careful aim, making every shot count. The battle lasted 65 minutes. Ferguson was killed, shot at least 8 times. Of his 900 men, 157 were killed, 163 so badly wounded they couldn't be moved, and the rest captured. The American frontiersmen lost only 28 killed and 62 wounded. It was a complete annihilation of a Loyalist force, and it sent shockwaves through the British command. Cornwallis, who had been preparing to invade North Carolina, retreated back into South Carolina. Congress, recognizing their error with Gates, made a crucial decision. They appointed General Nathaniel Greene to command the Southern Department. Greene was one of Washington's most trusted generals, a brilliant strategist who understood that he didn't need to win battles. He needed to wear down the British. Greene arrived in the South in December 1780 and immediately did something unconventional. He divided his already small army, sending Daniel Morgan with about 600 men to western South Carolina. Cornwallis took the bait, dividing his own force and sending Tarleton with over 1,000 men to destroy Morgan. Morgan chose his ground carefully at a place called Cowpens, near the North Carolina border. On January 17, 1781, he positioned his troops in 3 lines: militia in front, Continentals behind them, and cavalry in reserve. He told his militia they only needed to fire 2 volleys before falling back. When Tarleton attacked at dawn, confident of another easy victory, everything went according to Morgan's plan. The militia fired their volleys and withdrew. Tarleton's men, thinking the Americans were breaking, charged forward in disorder, straight into the waiting Continental regulars. At the crucial moment, the American cavalry swept around and crashed into the British flanks. The British line collapsed. In just 1 hour, Tarleton's force was destroyed. Of his 1,100 men, 110 were killed, over 200 wounded, and 525 captured. American losses were 12 killed and 60 wounded. It was one of the most brilliant tactical victories of the entire war. Now Cornwallis was furious. He was determined to catch and destroy Greene's army before it could escape into North Carolina. What followed was one of the most dramatic chases of the war. Greene and Morgan united their forces and raced north, with Cornwallis in pursuit. To move faster, Cornwallis destroyed his own baggage train, burning wagons, supplies, even officers' personal belongings. For weeks the armies marched through winter rains and freezing rivers, sometimes just hours apart. Greene reached the Dan River on the Virginia border first, and got his entire army across on February 14, 1781, taking or destroying all the boats. Cornwallis stood on the south bank, frustrated and exhausted, his army worn down and far from their supply bases. The chase had accomplished Greene's purpose. Cornwallis's army was weakened, and he had gained nothing. Greene now made a bold decision. He recrossed the Dan and moved back into North Carolina, gathering reinforcements. On March 15, 1781, he chose to make a stand at Guilford Courthouse. His army numbered about 4,400 men. Cornwallis had only 1,900, but Greene knew the quality difference. Most of his men were militia, while the British were veteran regulars. The battle raged through the afternoon. Like Morgan at Cowpens, Greene positioned his troops in defensive lines, hoping to bleed the British as they advanced. The fighting was vicious, often hand-to-hand. At one point, Cornwallis ordered his artillery to fire grape shot into a melee where British and American troops were intermixed, killing his own men to break the American line. The British finally took the field, and Greene withdrew in good order. Technically, Cornwallis had won, but the cost was catastrophic. He suffered over 532 casualties, more than a quarter of his army. Greene lost about 261 men. A British politician later observed that another such victory would destroy the British army. Cornwallis, his army battered and deep in hostile territory, made a fateful choice. Instead of retreating to Charleston, he decided to march to Virginia, where he believed he could link up with British forces and finally achieve the decisive victory that had eluded him. It was a decision that would determine the outcome of the war. Meanwhile, Greene turned south. While Cornwallis marched to Virginia, Greene methodically recaptured British posts across South Carolina and Georgia. He rarely won pitched battles. Indeed, he lost most of the major engagements he fought, but he won the campaign. By the end of 1781, the British would be confined to Charleston and Savannah, their grand southern strategy in ruins. The war had now lasted 6 years. Across the Atlantic, the conflict had spread globally. French and British fleets battled in the Caribbean and the Indian Ocean. Spanish forces captured British posts in Florida and along the Gulf Coast. The Dutch, having joined the war against Britain, fought in Asian waters. King George III government was fighting enemies on 4 continents, straining Britain's naval and financial resources to the breaking point. But the decisive moment was approaching. In Virginia, Cornwallis established a base at Yorktown, on a peninsula between the York and James rivers. He fortified the position and waited for reinforcements from British-controlled New York. He didn't realize that events were conspiring against him, that Washington, the French, and simple fortune were about to converge in a way that would end the war. Thousands of miles away, a French fleet under Admiral de Grasse was sailing north from the Caribbean. In New York, Washington was planning an attack on British-held Manhattan. In Philadelphia, Congress was nearly bankrupt, struggling to keep the war effort funded. And in Yorktown, Cornwallis's engineers were digging trenches and building earthworks, preparing for a siege that British naval power would surely break. But naval power works both ways. The element that would determine everything, control of the sea, was about to shift. And when it did, the Continental Army would have one chance, one perfect opportunity, to end the war in a single, decisive stroke. The revolution was about to reach its climax on a Virginia peninsula, where the fate of an infant nation would be decided not by grand strategy or brilliant tactics, but by the convergence of armies and fleets, by timing and fortune, and by the determination of men who had already endured 6 long years of war. The summer of 1781 found George Washington in a position he'd occupied for 6 long years, trying to hold together an army while searching for the opportunity to strike a decisive blow. His force of about 7,000 men, combined with nearly 5,000 French troops under the Comte de Rochambeau, sat outside British-held New York City. Washington had long dreamed of recapturing New York, the city he'd lost in 1776. But New York's defenses were formidable, and attacking them would be costly, perhaps impossible. Then, in mid-August, everything changed. Washington received word that Admiral de Grasse's French fleet, 28 ships of a line carrying 3,200 French troops, was sailing not to New York, but to the Chesapeake Bay, and de Grasse could only stay until mid-October before hurricane season forced him back to the Caribbean. Washington had been handed an opportunity, but it came with a ticking clock. Washington made his decision with remarkable speed. He would march his entire army, Continental and French forces together, 450 miles south to Virginia. It was an audacious plan, full of risk. He had to move thousands of men that distance in just weeks. He had to keep his intentions secret from the British in New York, and he had to arrive before de Grasse departed. Everything would need to go perfectly. The march began on August 19th. To deceive British General Henry Clinton in New York, Washington built fake camps and ovens in New Jersey, as if preparing for a siege. He spread rumors of attacking Staten Island. Only when his army was well south did the British realize they'd been fooled. Clinton sent urgent messages to Cornwallis in Virginia. Washington was coming. Hold Yorktown at all costs. Meanwhile, the fate of the campaign, and perhaps the war, was being decided at sea. On September 5th, a British fleet under Admiral Thomas Graves arrived at the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay, hoping to resupply Cornwallis or evacuate his army, if necessary. They found de Grasse's French fleet already there. The two fleets maneuvered and clashed in what became known as the Battle of the Chesapeake. The battle itself was indecisive. Both sides suffered damage, and neither fleet was destroyed. But what mattered was the outcome. After 5 days of maneuvering, the British fleet sailed back to New York for repairs. The French maintained control of the Chesapeake. Cornwallis's route of escape by sea was cut off. More importantly, additional French ships arrived carrying siege artillery, the massive guns that would be needed to pound Yorktown's fortifications into submission. Washington's army completed its march in just over a month, an extraordinary feat of logistics and endurance. The French troops from the Caribbean joined forces with those who had marched from New York. State militia from Virginia and Maryland swelled the ranks. By late September, approximately 17,000 American and French troops had converged on Yorktown, surrounding Cornwallis's 8,000 British and Hessian soldiers. Cornwallis found himself trapped on a peninsula, with an enemy army twice the size of his own to his front, and the French fleet controlling the waters behind him. He sent desperate messages to Clinton in New York, begging for reinforcements. Clinton promised a relief expedition was coming, but it would take time to organize. Cornwallis would have to hold out. On September 28th, the Allied forces completed their encirclement of Yorktown. The siege began in earnest. This was warfare of a different kind from the fluid battles and running fights that had characterized so much of the American Revolution. Siege warfare was methodical, technical, brutal. The goal was to move artillery close enough to pound the enemy's defenses into rubble, making them indefensible. Engineers marked out the first parallel, a long trench dug about 600 yards from the British fortifications, where troops could shelter while artillery was brought forward. For days, soldiers dug through the Virginia soil under darkness, creating miles of trenches. On October 9th, the Allied artillery opened fire. The bombardment was devastating. French and American guns hurled solid shot and explosive shells into Yorktown around the clock. One observer counted that at the height of the bombardage, a shell or cannonball landed inside Yorktown every 15 seconds. Buildings collapsed. British guns were destroyed. Cornwallis retreated to a cave near the waterfront, writing increasingly desperate letters. His soldiers, packed into shrinking defensive positions, suffered from lack of sleep, dwindling supplies, and the constant terror of the bombardment. On October 11th, American and French forces began digging a second parallel, even closer to the British lines, just 300 yards away. But two British redoubts, fortified positions, jutted out from their main line, preventing the Allied forces from extending their trenches. These redoubts would have to be taken by storm. On the night of October 14th, Washington ordered a coordinated assault on both redoubts. 400 French troops would attack Redoubt Number 9. 400 American light infantry under Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Hamilton would attack Redoubt Number 10. Hamilton was just 26 years old, Washington's former aide who had been begging for a field command. Now he had his chance. At 8 o'clock, signal shots rang out. The assault began. Hamilton's orders were to advance with unloaded muskets. They would rely on the bayonet to avoid alerting the British with gunfire. His men raced across the open ground in darkness. When British sentries raised the alarm and opened fire, the Americans were already at the walls. Hamilton was among the first over the parapet. The fighting was close and vicious, bayonets and swords in near total darkness. But within 10 minutes, Redoubt Number 10 was in American hands. Hamilton had lost 9 men killed and about 30 wounded. The French assault on Redoubt Number 9 took longer and cost more casualties, but it too succeeded. With the redoubts captured, American artillery could now be positioned even closer to the British lines. The noose was tightening. On the night of October 16th, Cornwallis made a desperate attempt to escape. He began ferrying his troops across the York River to Gloucester Point, hoping to break through the small Allied force there and march north to safety. But midway through the evacuation, a violent storm scattered the boats. By dawn, only part of his army had crossed, and he had to bring them back. The escape attempt had failed. By October 17th, exactly 4 years to the day since Burgoyne's surrender at Saratoga, Cornwallis knew his situation was hopeless. The Allied artillery had created gaping holes in his defenses. His casualties were mounting. Smallpox and typhoid fever ravaged his men. His ammunition was nearly exhausted, and Clinton's promised relief force was still days away at best. At 10 o'clock in the morning, a British drummer boy appeared on the parapet, beating the parley signal, a request to negotiate. An officer joined him, waving a white handkerchief. The Allied guns gradually fell silent. The officer was blindfolded and led through the American lines to Washington's headquarters. Cornwallis was requesting terms of surrender. The negotiations were brief. Washington, remembering how the British had denied honors of war to the American garrison that surrendered at Charleston, insisted on the same harsh terms for Cornwallis. The British would not be allowed to march out with colors flying and bands playing traditional honors. They would surrender as captured prisoners. On October 19th, 1781, in the early afternoon, the British and Hessian troops marched out of Yorktown to lay down their arms. According to tradition, their band played a tune called "The World Turned Upside Down," a fitting melody for the moment. The most powerful empire on earth had been defeated by its former colonies. Cornwallis himself claimed to be too ill to attend and sent his second-in-command, General Charles O'Hara, to surrender his sword. O'Hara first tried to hand it to Rochambeau, the French commander, but Rochambeau gestured toward Washington. O'Hara then approached Washington, but Washington, in a calculated gesture of protocol and perhaps revenge for Cornwallis's absence, directed O'Hara to his own second-in-command, General Benjamin Lincoln, the same man who had been forced to surrender at Charleston. Lincoln accepted the sword. Over 8,000 British and Hessian soldiers became prisoners of war. The Allies suffered only 389 casualties during the entire siege, 72 killed and 317 wounded. When news of Yorktown reached London in late November, it struck like a thunderbolt. The Prime Minister, Lord North, reportedly threw up his arms and cried, "Oh God, it is all over." He was right. Though the war would technically continue for more than a year, and though British forces still held New York, Charleston, and Savannah, the political will to continue fighting in America had collapsed. King George III wanted to fight on, but Parliament and the British people had had enough. The war had cost enormous amounts of blood and treasure, made Britain enemies around the globe, and now had produced a humiliating defeat. In March 1782, Parliament voted to begin peace negotiations. By late spring, Lord North's government had fallen, replaced by ministers committed to ending the war. For the Americans, Yorktown was vindication, proof that their long struggle had meaning, that their sacrifices had not been in vain. Washington had begun the war with an untrained militia and lost battle after battle. He had watched his army nearly disintegrate multiple times. He had endured Valley Forge, had seen cities occupied and states overrun, had witnessed the execution of spies and the betrayal of trusted officers. But he had never surrendered. He had kept his army intact, waiting for his moment. And when that moment came, when French ships and French troops and careful planning and good fortune all aligned, he had seized it with both hands. The Continental Army had won its decisive victory, but the harder work of building a nation was only just beginning. The question now was not whether America would be independent, but what kind of country this new nation would become. The surrender at Yorktown didn't end the war overnight. British troops still occupied New York City, Charleston, and Savannah. The Continental Army remained in the field, watchful and waiting. But everyone knew something fundamental had changed. The question was no longer whether America would gain independence, but on what terms and what would come after. The peace negotiations would take nearly 2 years. conducted in Paris by American diplomats who proved as shrewd at the negotiating table as their generals had been on the battlefield. Congress sent 3 commissioners to Paris. Benjamin Franklin, already there and beloved by French society; John Adams, the brilliant but prickly Massachusetts lawyer; and John Jay of New York, a skilled diplomat with a suspicious mind. Their instructions from Congress were to work closely with the French and defer to their guidance. But Jay quickly sensed that French interests and American interests didn't perfectly align. France's ally Spain wanted to limit American expansion westward and control navigation of the Mississippi River. France, exhausted by the war and managing multiple alliances, seemed willing to compromise American claims to satisfy its other partners. Jay convinced his fellow commissioners to negotiate secretly with Britain, directly and separately from France. It was a risky move that could have destroyed the American alliance, but it worked. The British negotiators, led by Richard Oswald, recognized an opportunity. If they granted generous terms to America, they might drive a wedge between the new nation and France, and perhaps establish future commercial ties with their former colonies. The negotiations proceeded through the fall of 1782. On November 30th, 1782, the American and British commissioners signed preliminary articles of peace. The terms were extraordinarily favorable to the United States. Britain recognized American independence. The new nation's boundaries would extend from the Atlantic Ocean to the Mississippi River, and from the Great Lakes to Spanish Florida, a vast territory far larger than the original 13 colonies. Americans would have fishing rights off Newfoundland and navigation rights on the Mississippi. British troops would evacuate all American territory. The formal Treaty of Paris wasn't signed until September 3rd, 1783, after Britain concluded peace with France, Spain, and the Netherlands. But the shape of the peace was set. The United States had gained not just independence, but an empire of land stretching westward, space for millions of future Americans to settle and build. When the news reached America, celebrations erupted in every town and village. Church bells rang, bonfires blazed. After 8 long years of war, peace had finally come. But the celebrations masked a troubling reality. The new nation was in crisis. Pause. Shift to domestic challenges. The war had been won, but at enormous cost. Congress had funded the war largely through paper money and loans, both foreign and domestic. The continental currency had become worthless. The national debt stood at approximately $27 million to foreign creditors and $11 million to domestic creditors, staggering sums for a nation with no reliable way to raise revenue. Individual states had their own debts, some exceeding millions more. Soldiers in the Continental Army, many of whom had served for years with irregular pay, or no pay at all, were owed back wages. Officers had been promised half pay for life in lieu of the salary increases they'd been denied. Now, with the war ending, these men wanted what they'd been promised, but Congress had no money to pay them. In March 1783, while the Army waited at Newburgh, New York, for the final peace treaty, discontent boiled over. Anonymous letters circulated among the officers, calling for a meeting to discuss their grievances. The letters suggested that if Congress wouldn't pay them, perhaps the Army should refuse to disband, or worse, should march on Congress itself and seize what they were owed. It was a call for military coup, unprecedented in American history. Washington acted decisively. On March 15, 1783, he appeared at a meeting of his officers. They expected him to support their demands, or at least sympathize. Instead, he delivered a speech urging patience and trust in Congress. He appealed to their honor and to everything they had fought for. As he began to read a letter from a congressman, Washington paused, fumbling in his pocket. He pulled out a pair of spectacles, something his officers had rarely seen him wear. "Gentlemen," he said, "you will permit me to put on my spectacles, for I have not only grown gray, but almost blind in the service of my country." The room fell silent. Some officers wept. The moment of danger passed. The officers voted to express confidence in Congress and rejected the path of rebellion. Washington's character, his willingness to subordinate military power to civilian authority, may have been his greatest contribution to the American experiment. In an era when successful generals often became dictators, Washington chose a different path. He would set this example again, even more dramatically, in the years to come. On November 25th, 1783, the last British troops evacuated New York City. Washington entered the city in triumph and said farewell to his officers at Fraunces Tavern. Embracing each man individually, he was too emotional to speak more than a few words. Then he left for Annapolis, where Congress was meeting, to resign his commission. On December 23rd, 1783, in a simple ceremony before Congress, George Washington stood and surrendered his military commission, returning power to the civilian government. "Having now finished the work assigned me," he said, "I retire from the great theater of action." Then he rode home to Mount Vernon, intending to return to private life. King George III, when told that Washington planned to resign rather than seize power, reportedly said, "If he does that, he will be the greatest man in the world." Washington did exactly that. His voluntary surrender of power established a precedent that would shape American democracy forever. The principle that military leaders serve the people, not rule them. But the nation Washington left behind was fragile. Since 1781, America had been governed by the Articles of Confederation, the first constitution that created a confederation of sovereign states with a weak central government. Congress could make treaties and declare war, but it couldn't tax, couldn't regulate commerce between states, and couldn't enforce its own laws. Each state printed its own money, imposed tariffs on goods from other states, and pursued its own interests. Some states, like New York and Virginia, were large and powerful. Others, like Delaware and Rhode Island, were tiny. They squabbled over borders, trade, and Western land claims. The United States was united in name only. Congress couldn't pay its debts because it had no power to raise revenue. It could only request money from the states, and the states often refused. Foreign nations viewed America as weak and unreliable. Spain closed the Mississippi River to American navigation. Britain refused to evacuate forts in the Northwest Territory, claiming Americans had violated the peace treaty by not repaying debts to British creditors. Debts Congress couldn't force the states to honor. The weakness of the government became undeniable in 1786, when farmers in western Massachusetts, crushed by debts and taxes, rose in armed rebellion. Led by Daniel Shays, a former Continental Army captain, hundreds of farmers took up weapons and prevented courts from sitting to foreclose on their farms. In January 1787, Shays led approximately 1,200 men in an attack on the Federal Armory at Springfield, hoping to seize weapons. The state militia, funded by wealthy Boston merchants, defeated the rebels, and Shays fled to Vermont. But the rebellion terrified America's political leaders. If armed uprisings could threaten government authority, if states couldn't maintain order, what did independence mean? Had Americans fought a revolution only to descend into anarchy? Even before Shays' rebellion, some leaders have been calling for a stronger national government. James Madison of Virginia, a slight, scholarly man who had studied every Republican history, believed the Articles of Confederation were fundamentally flawed. Alexander Hamilton, Washington's former aide, agreed. So did Washington himself, watching from Mount Vernon with growing alarm. In September 1786, delegates from 5 states met in Annapolis to discuss commercial problems. Hamilton and Madison used the meeting to call for a larger convention to meet in Philadelphia the following May, ostensibly to revise the Articles of Confederation. Congress, reluctant but desperate, endorsed the idea. The states agreed to send delegates. On May 25, 1787, 55 delegates from 12 states, Rhode Island refused to participate, gathered in Philadelphia State House, the same building where the Declaration of Independence had been signed. They represented the new nation's intellectual and political elite, wealthy planters, successful merchants, lawyers, and scholars. 29 were college educated, an extraordinary proportion for the era. Their average age was 42, though some, like Jonathan Dayton of New Jersey at 26, were much younger. George Washington, reluctantly drawn from retirement, was unanimously elected president of the convention. Benjamin Franklin, now 81, was the oldest delegate. James Madison, just 36, arrived with trunks full of books and a plan. The delegates voted to meet in secret, with no official records published and no press allowed. They locked the doors and posted guards. In the sweltering heat of a Philadelphia summer, they kept the windows shut to preserve secrecy. They began to debate the future of their nation. What happened in that room over the next 4 months would determine whether the American experiment survived or collapsed. The delegates faced fundamental questions that no people had ever been free to answer for themselves. How do you create a government strong enough to survive, but not so strong it becomes tyrannical? How do you balance the interests of large states and small states, of North and South, of different economic regions? How do you protect individual liberty while maintaining order? These men had won a revolution. Now, they would attempt something even more difficult, building a government that could preserve the fruits of that revolution for generations yet unborn. The convention was supposed to revise the Articles of Confederation, but within days, it became clear that revision wouldn't be enough. Edmund Randolph of Virginia rose and presented Madison's plan, a completely new constitution, creating a national government with powers the Articles had never imagined. The delegates were no longer tinkering with the existing system. They were starting over. Through that long, hot summer, they would argue, compromise, and create. They would nearly give up in frustration more than once. They would make bargains that would haunt the nation for generations. But they would also craft a document that, for all its flaws, would become the oldest written national constitution still in use. A framework flexible enough to guide a nation through centuries of change. The revolution had won America's independence. Now the real work of founding a nation was beginning. The Constitutional Convention began with a bold proposal that changed everything. On May 29, 1787, just 4 days into the proceedings, Edmund Randolph of Virginia presented what became known as the Virginia Plan. Written primarily by James Madison, it called for scrapping the Articles of Confederation entirely and creating a new national government with 3 separate branches: legislative, executive, and judicial. The legislative branch would be bicameral, 2 houses, with representation in both based on population. This immediately created a crisis. Large states like Virginia, Pennsylvania, and Massachusetts loved the plan. They had the people, so they would have the power. But small states like Delaware, New Jersey, and Connecticut reacted with alarm. Under this system, they would be perpetually outvoted by their larger neighbors. William Paterson of New Jersey countered with a New Jersey plan on June 15th, proposing to keep the existing structure where each state had one vote regardless of size, while granting Congress new powers to tax and regulate commerce. The debate that followed revealed the deepest fault line in the convention. This wasn't just a disagreement about government structure. It was a fight over whether America would be a nation of states or a nation of people. For weeks, the delegates argued. Tempers flared. Some threatened to walk out. Delaware's delegates announced that if proportional representation passed, they would leave the convention immediately. On June 28th, as tensions peaked, the elderly Benjamin Franklin rose to speak. He suggested they begin each session with a prayer, noting that during the darkest days of the Revolution, they had sought divine guidance. "How has it happened, sir, that we have not hitherto once thought of humbly applying to the Father of Lights to illuminate our understandings?" The prayer proposal was quietly set aside. Some delegates worried that suddenly calling for prayers would make it appear they were in desperate straits. But Franklin's intervention helped cool emotions. The convention appointed a committee to find a compromise. What emerged would save the convention and shape American government forever. On July 16th, the delegates narrowly approved what became known as the Great Compromise, or the Connecticut Compromise. The House of Representatives would be based on population, giving larger states more power there. But the Senate would give each state 2 senators, regardless of size. It satisfied no one completely, which perhaps made it the perfect compromise. Large states got proportional representation in one chamber. Small states got equal representation in the other. But an even more troubling issue lurked beneath these debates: slavery. The word itself rarely appeared in the convention's discussions. Delegates used euphemisms like "other persons" and "such persons as any state shall think proper to admit." But the institution cast a shadow over every major decision. The question arose in its starkest form during debates over representation. If representation in the House would be based on population, how would enslaved people be counted? Southern states wanted enslaved people counted for representation purposes, giving them more power in Congress, while simultaneously denying these same people any rights as citizens. Northern delegates objected. Gouverneur Morris of Pennsylvania delivered an impassioned speech denouncing slavery as a nefarious institution, the curse of heaven on the states where it prevailed. But moral arguments collided with political reality. The Southern states made clear they would never ratify a constitution that threatened slavery or denied them representation for their enslaved populations. And without the South, there would be no union. The delegates reached another compromise, one that would stain the Constitution's legacy. Enslaved people would be counted as 3/5 of a person for purposes of representation and taxation. The 3/5 compromise, as it became known, satisfied no one's conscience, but seemed necessary to keep the convention together. It gave Southern states significantly more power in the House of Representatives and in the Electoral College, which would choose the president, than their free populations alone would warrant. It was a devil's bargain, trading moral principle for political unity. The convention made other concessions to slavery as well. They agreed that Congress could not ban the international slave trade until 1808, giving the institution 20 more years of legal importation of enslaved Africans. They included a fugitive slave clause, requiring that enslaved people who escaped to free states be returned to their enslavers. These provisions were the price of union, but they would poison American politics for generations. Beyond these compromises on representation and slavery, the delegates crafted an intricate system of checks and balances. They created a presidency unlike any executive office in the world. powerful but limited, elected but not a monarch. The president would command the military, conduct foreign policy, and execute the laws, but Congress could override vetoes, control spending, and impeach the president for misconduct. They created a Supreme Court and a federal judiciary, but left many details to future Congresses to determine. They gave the new government power to tax, to regulate commerce between states, to raise armies and make war. But they also limited that government, carefully enumerating its powers while reserving all others to the states or the people. One of the most innovative features was the electoral college system for choosing the president. The delegates didn't trust direct popular election. They worried that voters couldn't know enough about candidates from distant states, and that demagogues might sweep to power on waves of temporary passion. But they also didn't want Congress to choose the president, fearing that would make the executive dependent on the legislature. Their solution was complex. Each state would appoint electors equal to its total number of senators and representatives. These electors would meet in their own states and vote for president. The person with the most votes would become president. The runner-up would become vice president. It was an elaborate system designed to filter the people's will through a body of learned, deliberative men. By early September, the shape of the Constitution was largely settled. Gouverneur Morris, known for his eloquence, was assigned to write the final draft. He produced a preamble that transformed the document's meaning with a single phrase. Earlier drafts had begun, "We the people of the states of New Hampshire, Massachusetts," listing each state. Morris instead wrote, "We the people of the United States." 3 simple words, "We the people," established that the Constitution's authority came not from state governments, but from the American people themselves. It was a profound statement of democratic theory, claiming that sovereignty resided in the people, who were creating a government to serve them. On September 17, 1787, after nearly 4 months of debate, the convention completed its work. Not everyone was satisfied. Edmund Randolph and George Mason of Virginia refused to sign, believing the Constitution gave too much power to the central government and lacked a Bill of Rights. Elbridge Gerry of Massachusetts also refused, but 39 delegates stepped forward to add their signatures. Benjamin Franklin, too weak to stand for long, had written a speech that James Wilson read for him. Franklin acknowledged the Constitution's imperfections, but argued that it was the best they could achieve. "I consent, sir, to this Constitution because I expect no better, and because I'm not sure that it is not the best." He urged every delegate who had reservations to doubt a little of his own infallibility and sign the document. As the last signatures were added, Franklin looked at the sun painted on the back of Washington's chair. He remarked to those nearby that painters had always found it difficult to distinguish a rising sun from a setting sun. "But now at length," he said, "I have the happiness to know that it is a rising and not a setting sun." But the convention's work was only the beginning. Article 7 specified that the Constitution would take effect when ratified by conventions in 9 of the 13 states. This was itself revolutionary. The Constitution bypassed state legislatures entirely, appealing directly to the people through special ratifying conventions. But also meant a battle lay ahead. The Confederation Congress sent the Constitution to the states for consideration. Public debate immediately erupted. Those who supported the Constitution became known as Federalists. Those who opposed it, fearing it created a dangerously powerful central government, were called Anti-Federalists. The Anti-Federalists raised serious concerns. Where was the Bill of Rights protecting individual liberties? Why was the president so powerful? Why could this government tax citizens directly without going through state governments? Wouldn't this create a distant, aristocratic elite that would tyrannize ordinary citizens? Hadn't they just fought a revolution against concentrated power? The Federalists had answers. Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay began writing a series of newspaper essays under the pseudonym Publius, explaining and defending the Constitution. These essays, eventually numbering 85, became known as the Federalist Papers. They remain the most important commentary on the Constitution ever written, explaining the theory of republican government and the necessity of the proposed system. The ratification battle played out state by state through the winter and spring of 1787 to 88. Delaware ratified first unanimously on December 7, 1787. Pennsylvania followed 5 days later. New Jersey and Georgia ratified unanimously in early January. Connecticut followed in February. These quick ratifications gave Federalists momentum, but harder fights loomed. Massachusetts was closely divided. The state convention debated for weeks, with anti-Federalists pointing to the lack of a Bill of Rights. The Federalists won ratification on February 6, 1788, but only by a narrow vote of 187 to 168, and only after agreeing to recommend amendments protecting individual rights. Maryland and South Carolina ratified in the spring. On June 21, 1788, New Hampshire became the 9th state to ratify by a vote of 57 to 47. Technically, the Constitution could now take effect, but everyone knew that without Virginia and New York, the largest and most influential states, the new nation would be crippled from the start. Virginia's convention was fierce. Patrick Henry, the great orator of the Revolution, led the opposition, warning that the Constitution would destroy liberty. James Madison led the Federalist forces, arguing day after day for the necessity of stronger union. On June 25th, Virginia ratified by the narrow margin of 89 to 79. New York remained. Alexander Hamilton fought desperately for ratification in a convention dominated by anti-Federalists. News of Virginia's ratification helped shift opinion. On July 26, 1788, New York ratified by the slim vote of 30 to 27. The Constitution had been ratified. The American experiment was about to enter a new phase. A government created by the people, resting on their consent, checked and balanced to prevent tyranny. It was a gamble that the world watched with skepticism. Could such a government actually work? Would this republic survive? Those questions would soon be answered. The nation needed to elect its first Congress, its first president, and begin the work of turning words on parchment into a functioning government. And everyone knew who that first president would have to be. The ratification of the Constitution marked a new beginning, but the work of actually creating a government from words on parchment remained. In the fall of 1788, the Confederation Congress set dates for the new government to begin. Electors would be chosen in January 1789. They would vote for president in February, and the new government would convene on March 4th in New York City, the temporary capital. There was never any real question about who would be the first president. Every elector in the Electoral College cast one of their votes for George Washington. He received all 69 electoral votes, the only president in American history to be elected unanimously. John Adams, with 34 votes, became vice president. Washington received the news at Mount Vernon with mixed feelings. He was 57 years old, suffering from rheumatism, and had looked forward to spending his remaining years in peaceful retirement. But he understood that the success of the new government might depend on his willingness to serve. On April 16, 1789, he left Mount Vernon for New York, writing in his diary that he departed with a mind oppressed with more anxious and painful sensations than I have words to express. His journey north became a triumphal procession. At every town and village, crowds gathered to cheer him. School children scattered flowers in his path. In Philadelphia, 20,000 people turned out to see him. At Trenton, women and girls dressed in white greeted him at the bridge where he had won his famous victory, singing an ode specially composed for the occasion. On April 30th, 1789, Washington took the oath of office on the balcony of Federal Hall in New York City. He placed his hand on a Bible, borrowed at the last moment because no one had thought to bring one, and repeated the words, "I do solemnly swear that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States, and will to the best of my ability preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States." Then, unrehearsed and spontaneous, he added, "So help me God." After the oath, Washington delivered his inaugural address inside the Senate chamber, speaking in a voice so low that many struggled to hear him. He was visibly nervous, his hands trembling, but his words set important precedents, establishing a tone of humility and service that would shape the office. The new government faced immediate, practical challenges. The Constitution provided a framework, but left countless details unspecified. How many executive departments would there be, and what would they do? How would the federal court system be organized? How would the government raise revenue? What would the president be called? Your Excellency? Your Highness? These questions, seemingly minor, mattered enormously. The new government faced immediate, practical challenges. The Constitution provided a framework, but left countless details unspecified. How many executive departments would there be, and what would they do? How would the federal court system be organized? How would the government raise revenue? What would the president be called? Your Excellency? Your Highness? These questions, seemingly minor, mattered enormously. Congress moved quickly to establish the executive branch. In July and August 1789, they created 3 departments: the Department of State to handle foreign affairs, the Department of the Treasury to manage finances, and the Department of War to oversee military matters. Washington appointed Thomas Jefferson as Secretary of State, Alexander Hamilton as Secretary of the Treasury, and Henry Knox as Secretary of War. He also appointed Edmund Randolph as Attorney General, though that wasn't yet a full department. These 4 men, Jefferson, Hamilton, Knox, and Randolph, became Washington's principal advisors, though the term cabinet didn't appear in the Constitution. Washington invented the practice of consulting them as a group, creating another precedent that would endure. The presidency was being defined day by day, decision by decision, through Washington's actions. Congress also tackled the federal judiciary. The Constitution established a Supreme Court, but left the details to Congress. The Judiciary Act of 1789, passed in September, created a Supreme Court with 1 Chief Justice and 5 Associate Justices, 6 total. It also established 13 district courts and 3 circuit courts, creating the 3-tiered federal court system that still exists today. Washington appointed John Jay of New York as the first Chief Justice. Jay had co-authored the Federalist Papers and served as a diplomat during the Revolution. The appointment signaled that the Supreme Court would be staffed by the nation's most distinguished legal minds. But the most pressing unfinished business was the promise made during ratification, a Bill of Rights. Massachusetts, Virginia, New York, and other states had ratified only with the understanding that amendments protecting individual liberties would be added immediately. Many anti-federalists had warned that without explicit protections, the new government would inevitably infringe on fundamental freedoms. James Madison, now serving in the House of Representatives, took the lead. He sifted through more than 200 amendments proposed by various state ratifying conventions and crafted a list of protections. On September 25, 1789, Congress approved 12 amendments and sent them to the states for ratification. The first two amendments, dealing with congressional representation and congressional pay, were not ratified by enough states, but the remaining 10 were ratified by December 15, 1791, becoming the Bill of Rights. These amendments guaranteed freedom of religion, speech, press, and assembly. They protected the right to bear arms, security against unreasonable searches, trial by jury, and due process of law. They reserved powers not granted to the federal government to the states and the people. The Bill of Rights was more than a list of protections. It was a statement of political philosophy. It declared that certain rights existed beyond government's power to grant or revoke, that individuals possessed liberties that no majority could vote away. It would become the most cherished part of the Constitution, the foundation of American civil liberties. Meanwhile, Secretary of the Treasury Alexander Hamilton was addressing the nation's desperate financial situation. The war debts remained unpaid. The government had no revenue system. State currencies competed with each other. Foreign nations doubted America's creditworthiness. Without sound finances, Hamilton believed, the new government would collapse just as the Confederation had. In January 1790, Hamilton submitted his report on public credit to Congress. It was a bold and comprehensive plan to establish the nation's financial credibility. Hamilton proposed that the federal government assume all debts at full value, both the national debt and the individual states' war debts. This would total approximately $77 million, an enormous sum. His reasoning was brilliant and controversial. By assuming state debts, the federal government would bind wealthy creditors, the people who held government bonds, to the success of the national government. They would have a stake in its survival. By paying debts at full value rather than renegotiating, the government would establish its creditworthiness, making it possible to borrow money in the future at favorable rates. But Hamilton's plan ignited fierce opposition. Many Revolutionary veterans had sold their government bonds to speculators for pennies on the dollar, desperate for cash during hard times. Now those speculators would profit enormously if the bonds were redeemed at full value. James Madison argued this was unjust. Why should speculators get rich while veterans got nothing? Hamilton countered that the government's obligation was to whoever currently held the bonds, not to trace every transaction. If the government started picking and choosing which debts to honor based on who held them, no one would ever trust American credit again. The debate over assumption of state debts was equally fierce. States like Virginia and Maryland had already paid much of their war debt through heavy taxation. Why should they now help pay off the debts of states like Massachusetts and South Carolina, which hadn't? Southern states particularly opposed assumption, seeing it as a scheme to benefit Northern financial interests. The battle nearly tore the new government apart before it had barely begun. Then, in June 1790, a famous dinner brought together three men who would forge a compromise. Thomas Jefferson hosted Alexander Hamilton and James Madison at his residence in New York. Over dinner, they made a deal. Hamilton would secure enough votes from Northern congressmen to move the nation's permanent capital to a site on the Potomac River between Maryland and Virginia, the South's preference. In exchange, Madison would not block assumption of state debts, allowing enough Southern votes to pass Hamilton's financial plan. It was politics at its most practical, a trade of regional interests to keep the government functioning. Congress approved Hamilton's plan in July 1790. The federal government would assume all debts, establish the Bank of the United States to manage finances, and issue new bonds backed by customs duties and excise taxes. The Residence Act, passed at the same time, designated a 10-mile square district on the Potomac as the permanent capital, to be ready by 1800. Philadelphia would serve as the temporary capital until then. But these compromises only temporarily masked growing divisions. Hamilton and Jefferson, both brilliant men serving in Washington's cabinet, represented fundamentally different visions of America's future. Hamilton envisioned a strong commercial republic with a powerful central government, robust manufacturing, and close ties to Britain. Jefferson dreamed of an agrarian democracy of independent farmers, with power remaining close to the people in states and localities, in friendship with Republican France. These weren't just policy disagreements. They reflected different understandings of what the Revolution had been fought for and what kind of nation America should become. Through the early 1790s, these differences hardened into the first American political parties, Hamilton's Federalists and Jefferson's Democratic Republicans. Events in France accelerated the divide. The French Revolution, which began in 1789 with the storming of the Bastille, had initially excited Americans. Here was another people throwing off tyranny, seemingly inspired by the American example. But by 1793, the French Revolution had turned radical and violent. King Louis XVI was executed in January. The revolutionary government declared war on Britain, Spain, and the Netherlands. France descended into the terror, with thousands guillotined. Americans were torn. France had been their crucial ally during the Revolution, but the violence in Paris shocked many. Should America support its former ally? Should it maintain neutrality? When French Revolutionary envoy Edmond Charles Genet arrived in Charleston in April 1793, he was greeted as a hero by Jeffersonian Republicans. He began commissioning American ships as privateers to attack British vessels, bypassing the U.S. government entirely. Washington acted decisively. On April 22, 1793, he issued a proclamation of neutrality, declaring that the United States would be friendly and impartial toward all the warring nations. America would not take sides in European conflicts. It was a crucial precedent, establishing the principle that the new nation would chart its own course, not be drawn into Europe's perpetual wars. But neutrality was easier to proclaim than to maintain. Britain and France both interfered with American shipping. The British Navy seized American ships, trading with French colonies, and impressed American sailors, kidnapping them into British service, claiming they were deserters from the Royal Navy. By 1794, war with Britain seemed likely. Washington sent Chief Justice John Jay to Britain to negotiate a settlement. The resulting treaty, signed in November 1794, averted war but satisfied almost no one. Britain agreed to evacuate its forts in the Northwest Territory, something they should have done after the Peace of 1783, and granted limited trading rights to American ships. But the treaty said nothing about impressment, nothing about compensation for seized ships, and granted Britain favorable trading terms. When the treaty's terms became public in 1795, a storm of protest erupted. Jeffersonian Republicans denounced it as a betrayal of France and a surrender to British interests. Hamilton was stoned while defending it at a public meeting. Jay joked that he could travel across the country by the light of his burning effigies. But Washington, after careful consideration, signed the treaty. He believed peace was essential for the young nation's survival. The Senate ratified it by exactly the minimum two-thirds majority required, 20-10. America would remain at peace with Britain, but the political cost was severe. The treaty deepened the divide between Federalists and Republicans and made Washington, for the first time, a target of bitter partisan attacks. As Washington's second term drew toward its close in 1796, the first president prepared to leave office. He had served 8 years, established countless precedents, kept the nation at peace, and given it time to grow stronger. But he was weary of partisan battles and longing for home. He had one more gift to give the nation, his farewell address. In it, he would warn of the dangers ahead, the threats of partisan division, regional rivalry, and foreign entanglements. His words would resonate through American history, a testament to the wisdom of the man who, more than any other, had given the nation both its independence and its government. The founding era was reaching its culmination. The revolution had been won, the Constitution created and ratified, the government established and tested. But could this republic survive the transfer of power from one president to another? That final test was about to come. In September 1796, newspapers across America published George Washington's farewell address. He had decided not to seek a third term, establishing yet another precedent, that presidents should voluntarily relinquish power rather than cling to it indefinitely. After nearly 20 years of public service, from commanding the Continental Army through 8 years as president, Washington was finally going home to Mount Vernon. But his farewell was more than a retirement announcement. It was a distillation of wisdom gained through leading the nation from birth. Washington warned against the baneful effects of the spirit of party, arguing that partisan divisions would weaken the government and make it vulnerable to foreign influence. He cautioned against permanent alliances with foreign nations, advising the country to maintain commercial relations but avoid political entanglements in European affairs. The nation which indulges toward another in habitual hatred or in habitual fondness, he wrote, is in some degree a slave. These words would echo through American history, shaping foreign policy debates for generations. Washington's vision was of an independent republic, strong enough to stand alone, wise enough not to be drawn into other nations' conflicts. The address was a fitting capstone to his career, but it couldn't stop the forces it warned against. Partisan division was already hardening into organized political parties, and the election of 1796 would reveal just how deep those divisions ran. The election of 1796 was the first truly contested presidential election in American history. The Federalists nominated John Adams for president and Thomas Pinckney for vice president. The Democratic Republicans supported Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr. There was no formal campaign in the modern sense. Candidates didn't travel the country giving speeches or debate each other. But newspapers attacked with vicious intensity, and political operatives worked behind the scenes. When the electoral votes were counted in February 1797, Adams had won the presidency with 71 electoral votes. But Jefferson, with 68 votes, became vice president under the system where the runner-up assumed that office. The president and vice president were now from opposing parties, a situation that quickly proved unworkable. John Adams took office on March 4th, 1797, in Philadelphia. Washington attended the inauguration, standing to the side as Adams was sworn in. The moment symbolized the peaceful transfer of power from one leader to another, something that seemed routine today but was revolutionary in 1797. Most nations transferred power through heredity or violence. America had done it through ballots. Adams inherited a difficult situation. Relations with France had deteriorated sharply after Jay's treaty with Britain. The French saw the treaty as evidence that America had sided with their British enemies. French privateers began seizing American merchant ships. Over 300 were captured in 1797 alone. France refused to receive the American minister and demanded payments before they would even negotiate. In October 1797, Adams sent a three-man delegation to Paris to negotiate peace: Charles Cotesworth Pinckney, John Marshall, and Elbridge Gerry. What happened next became one of the most infamous diplomatic incidents in American history. French Foreign Minister Talleyrand refused to meet with the Americans officially. Instead, three agents, later identified in diplomatic dispatches only as X, Y, and Z, approached the Americans with demands: a bribe of $250,000 for Talleyrand personally, a loan of $12 million to France, and an apology from President Adams for anti-French statements. The American delegates were outraged. Pinckney's response became legendary: "No, not a sixpence." When the news reached America in April 1798, the public reaction was explosive. The slogan, "Millions for defense, but not 1 cent for tribute," swept the nation. Congress authorized the expansion of the Navy, the creation of a separate department of the Navy, and the raising of a provisional army. An undeclared naval war, the Quasi-War, began with France. American naval vessels and French privateers fought dozens of engagements over the next 2 years. The U.S. Navy captured over 80 French ships. The most famous battle came in February 1799, when the USS Constellation defeated the French frigate L'Insurgent, capturing it after a fierce hour-long battle. These naval victories gave Americans pride in their new navy and demonstrated that the young nation could defend its interests at sea. But the crisis with France also unleashed political repression at home. Federalists in Congress, convinced that French agents and their Republican sympathizers were undermining the government, passed a series of laws in 1798 known collectively as the Alien and Sedition Acts. The Alien Acts extended the residency requirement for citizenship from 5 to 14 years and gave the president power to deport foreigners deemed dangerous. The Sedition Act was more ominous. It made it a crime to publish false, scandalous, and malicious writing against the government or the president. The law was clearly aimed at Republican newspaper editors who criticized the Adams administration. The Sedition Act led to the prosecution of at least 25 men, most of them Republican editors and printers. Congressman Matthew Lyon of Vermont was imprisoned for 4 months for publishing criticisms of Adams. The prosecutions backfired politically. Lyon was re-elected to Congress from his jail cell, and the Federalists came to be seen as tyrants suppressing free speech. Jefferson and Madison responded with the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions, passed by those state legislatures in 1798 and 1799. These resolutions argued that the states had the right to judge whether federal laws were constitutional and to nullify unconstitutional laws within their borders. It was a radical doctrine that would resurface throughout American history, most destructively in the crisis over slavery decades later. But in 1799, the immediate crisis began to ease. Adams, demonstrating political courage that would cost him re-election, decided to pursue peace with France despite opposition from his own party. Alexander Hamilton and other Federalist leaders wanted to continue building the army and prepare for war, but Adams believed peace was in the nation's interest. In February 1799, he nominated William Vans Murray as minister to France to negotiate a settlement. The decision split the Federalist Party just as the election of 1800 approached. Hamilton, nominally of Adams's own party, worked behind the scenes to undermine the president's re-election. The campaign became the most bitter in American history to that point. Federalists portrayed Jefferson as an atheist and a radical who would bring the chaos of the French Revolution to America. Republicans attacked Adams as a monarchist who wanted to establish a royal dynasty. The voting stretched from April through October 1800, with different states choosing electors at different times. When all the votes were counted, Jefferson and his running mate Aaron Burr each had 73 electoral votes. Adams received 65 votes. The Federalists had been defeated, but the tie between Jefferson and Burr created a constitutional crisis. Under the Constitution, as it then existed, the House of Representatives would decide between Jefferson and Burr, with each state delegation casting one vote. The House was still controlled by lame duck Federalists who had been defeated but whose terms hadn't yet expired. Some Federalists preferred Burr, whom they considered less principled and therefore easier to deal with. Others simply wanted to deny Jefferson the presidency. The voting began on February 11th, 1801. On the first ballot, Jefferson won 8 states, one short of the majority needed. Burr won 6 states. 2 state delegations were evenly divided and couldn't vote. Ballot after ballot was taken, 19 ballots on the first day alone. For nearly a week, through 35 ballots, the deadlock held. The nation waited anxiously. What if no president could be chosen? What if the Federalists simply refused to seat Jefferson? Would there be violence? Would the Union itself dissolve? Behind the scenes, Alexander Hamilton, despite his hatred of Jefferson, worked to break the deadlock. He wrote letters to Federalist congressmen arguing that Burr was the most dangerous man in America, while Jefferson, though wrong-headed in Hamilton's view, at least had principles. Hamilton's intervention helped shift opinion. On the 36th ballot, on February 17, 1801, several Federalist congressmen from states that had supported Burr cast blank ballots instead. This allowed Jefferson to win 10 states and the presidency. The crisis had passed, but it revealed a dangerous flaw in the Constitution. The 12th Amendment, ratified in 1804, would change the system so that electors voted separately for president and vice president, preventing such a tie between running mates from happening again. On March 4th, 1801, Thomas Jefferson walked from his boarding house to the Capitol for his inauguration, a deliberate display of Republican simplicity. He wore plain clothes, not the formal attire that Washington and Adams had worn. His inaugural address sought to heal partisan divisions. "We are all Republicans. We are all Federalists," he declared, arguing that despite disagreements, all Americans shared fundamental principles. But the most significant moment came not in the speech, but in the peaceful transfer of power itself. For the first time in modern history, one party had peacefully surrendered control of a government to its political opponents after losing an election. The Federalists, despite their defeat and despite controlling the government, had not clung to power. They had accepted the voters' judgment and stepped aside. John Adams, bitter about his defeat and refusing to attend Jefferson's inauguration, left Washington before dawn on the day Jefferson took office. But his departure, however ungracious, was voluntary. He went home peacefully. There were no troops in the streets, no political prisoners, no purges. The young republic had survived its most dangerous test, the test of whether democratic change could happen without violence. In just 25 years, Americans had achieved something extraordinary. They had rebelled against the world's most powerful empire and won. They had created a new form of government, one based not on tradition or force, but on written law and popular consent. They had survived internal divisions, foreign threats, and the dangerous transition from one leader to another. The founders were not perfect men. They owned slaves while writing about liberty. They excluded women and non-property owners from political participation while proclaiming that all men were created equal. They nearly tore their young nation apart through partisan conflict. But they had created something remarkable, a framework flexible enough to be amended, strong enough to endure, and open enough that future generations could expand the promises of freedom and equality to include those initially left out. George Washington died on December 14, 1799, at Mount Vernon, just before the new century dawned. He didn't live to see the peaceful transfer of power in 1801, but his example had made it possible. In his lifetime, he had transformed from a British colonial officer to the father of a new nation. He had proven that republicanism could work, that power could be wielded responsibly and relinquished gracefully. The nation Washington helped create would face tremendous challenges ahead: westward expansion, conflicts with native peoples, the growing crisis over slavery, civil war, and struggles over civil rights. But the foundation had been laid. The Constitution would endure. The Republic would survive. As America celebrates its 250th anniversary, we look back on these founding years with clarity about both their achievements and their failures. The founders created a nation conceived in liberty, as Lincoln would later say, but didn't fully deliver on that promise. They established government of the people, by the people, for the people, but limited who counted as the people. They built a structure that would allow their descendants to continue the work they had begun, the ongoing work of creating a more perfect union. The story of America's founding is not just history. It's the story of how ordinary people, with all their flaws and contradictions, dared to imagine something new. They believed that people could govern themselves, that rights came from human dignity rather than royal grant, that freedom was worth any sacrifice. They took those beliefs and wrote them in a law, fought for them on battlefields, and defended them through decades of political struggle. They gave us not a perfect nation, but the tools to keep improving it. They gave us not answers to every question, but a system for working through our disagreements. They gave us not freedom for all, but the language and ideals that would one day make freedom for all possible. That is the legacy of the founding, not a finished product, but an ongoing promise. And 250 years later, that promise still calls to us, challenging each generation to take up the work of building the nation the founders began, striving always toward the ideals they proclaimed even when they fell short of them. This is the story of how America was founded. It's a story of revolution and creation, of vision and compromise, of great achievement and profound failure. It's a human story, flawed and inspiring in equal measure. And it's a story that, in many ways, is still being written. Thomas Jefferson's presidency marked a new chapter in the American story, one that would test whether the ideals of the founding could expand beyond the original 13 states into a continental vision. Jefferson had long dreamed of an empire of liberty, a vast republic of independent farmers spreading across the North American continent. In 1803, he would get an unexpected opportunity to make that dream a reality. The story began not in Washington, but in Europe, where Napoleon Bonaparte dominated the continent. France had regained the Louisiana Territory from Spain in 1800 through a secret treaty. This vast region stretched from the Mississippi River to the Rocky Mountains, from the Gulf of Mexico to the Canadian border. The prospect of a powerful France controlling this territory alarmed Jefferson. American farmers depended on the Mississippi River to transport their goods to market through the port of New Orleans. If France closed that port or interfered with American shipping, it could strangle the economy of the Western territories. Jefferson sent James Monroe to Paris in 1803 to join Robert Livingston, the American minister there, with instructions to negotiate the purchase of New Orleans and as much of the Gulf Coast as possible. Congress authorized them to spend up to $10 million. What happened next shocked everyone. Napoleon, preparing for renewed war with Britain and desperate for cash, decided to sell not just New Orleans, but the entire Louisiana Territory. On April 30th, 1803, Livingston and Monroe signed a treaty purchasing approximately 828,000 square miles of territory for $15 million, about 3 cents per acre. It was the largest land acquisition in American history, doubling the size of the United States overnight. But Jefferson faced a dilemma. He had always advocated for strict interpretation of the Constitution, arguing that the federal government possessed only those powers explicitly granted to it. Nowhere did the Constitution mention the power to acquire new territory. Jefferson considered proposing a constitutional amendment to authorize the purchase, but his advisors warned that delay might give Napoleon time to change his mind. In the end, Jefferson set aside his constitutional scruples and sent the treaty to the Senate, arguing that the president's treaty-making power was sufficient authority. The Senate ratified the Louisiana Purchase on October 20th, 1803, by a vote of 24-7. Jefferson had shown pragmatism over principle, and the nation had acquired a territory that would eventually become 15 states. Even before the purchase was finalized, Jefferson had been planning an expedition to explore the vast Western territory. He chose his private secretary, Meriwether Lewis, to lead the expedition, and Lewis selected William Clark as his co-commander. Their mission was to find a water route to the Pacific Ocean, establish relations with Native American tribes, and document the geography, plants, animals, and resources of the region. The Corps of Discovery, as the expedition was called, departed from St. Louis in May 1804 with approximately 45 men. They traveled up the Missouri River, crossing the Great Plains and the Rocky Mountains. A Shoshone woman named Sacagawea, along with her French-Canadian husband Toussaint Charbonneau, joined the expedition and proved invaluable as interpreters and guides. Her presence also signaled to native tribes that this was not a war party. The journey was grueling. They endured brutal winters, near starvation, dangerous river crossings, and encounters with grizzly bears. They traveled over 8,000 miles through territory unknown to Americans. In November 1805, they finally reached the Pacific Ocean at the mouth of the Columbia River. Clark wrote in his journal, "Ocean in view. Oh, the joy." The expedition returned to St. Louis in September 1806, having been gone for more than 2 years. They brought back detailed maps, journals filled with scientific observations, and specimens of plants and animals never before seen by American scientists. They had proven that an overland route to the Pacific was possible, though far more difficult than anyone had imagined. Most importantly, they had extended American presence and claims across the continent. But while Americans looked westward with excitement, they faced growing dangers at sea. Britain and France were locked in a titanic struggle for control of Europe. The Napoleonic Wars consumed the continent, and both powers tried to prevent neutral nations from trading with their enemies. Britain's Royal Navy was the dominant force at sea, and British warships stopped American merchant vessels, searching them for contraband and for British sailors. The practice of impressment became particularly inflammatory. British naval officers would board American ships and seize sailors they claimed were British subjects who had deserted the Royal Navy. Often they were wrong. Many were native-born Americans. But Britain, desperately short of sailors for its massive fleet, continued the practice. Between 1803 and 1812, the British impressed approximately 6,000 American sailors, forcing them to serve in the Royal Navy under brutal conditions. The crisis reached a breaking point on June 22, 1807. The British warship HMS Leopard stopped the American frigate USS Chesapeake just off the coast of Virginia, demanding to search for deserters. When Chesapeake's commander, James Barron, refused, the Leopard opened fire without warning. The Chesapeake, unprepared for battle, managed to fire only a single shot and return before surrendering. 3 American sailors were killed and 18 wounded. The British boarded, seized for men they claimed were deserters, and sailed away. News of the attack outraged Americans. It had occurred in American territorial waters, and the Chesapeake had been a warship, not a merchant vessel. Many demanded war with Britain, but Jefferson, knowing the United States was unprepared for war, chose a different path. He pursued what he called peaceable coercion, economic pressure instead of military force. In December 1807, Congress passed the Embargo Act, which prohibited American ships from sailing to foreign ports and barred foreign ships from taking cargo from American ports. Jefferson believed that Britain and France, dependent on American trade for food and raw materials, would be forced to respect American neutrality. It was an experiment in whether economic warfare could replace military warfare. The embargo was a disaster. American merchants, sailors, and farmers were devastated as trade collapsed. Exports fell from $108 million in 1807 to just $22 million in 1808. Ships rotted at their docks. Unemployment soared in port cities. Smuggling became rampant, especially along the Canadian border. New England, heavily dependent on shipping, turned bitterly against Jefferson and his party. Britain and France, meanwhile, barely noticed. They found other sources of supply and other markets. The embargo hurt America far more than its intended targets. Jefferson left office in March 1809, and Congress repealed the embargo just days before. It had been 15 months of economic suffering that achieved nothing. James Madison succeeded Jefferson as president in 1809. Madison had been Jefferson's Secretary of State and shared his vision of limited government and agrarian democracy. But he inherited the unresolved crisis with Britain. Congress tried various forms of trade restrictions, attempting to play Britain and France against each other, but nothing worked effectively. Meanwhile, tensions grew on the western frontier. Native American tribes, alarmed by the relentless westward expansion of American settlers, were organizing resistance. A Shawnee leader named Tecumseh and his brother Tenskwatawa, known as the Prophet, built a confederacy of tribes stretching from the Great Lakes to the Gulf Coast. They preached a return to traditional ways and unified resistance to American expansion. In November 1811, while Tecumseh was away recruiting southern tribes, William Henry Harrison, governor of Indiana Territory, led a force of about 1,000 men against Prophetstown, the Confederacy's headquarters on the Tippecanoe River. On November 7th, native warriors attacked Harrison's camp in a pre-dawn assault. The Battle of Tippecanoe was fierce and bloody. Harrison's forces suffered 62 killed and 126 wounded, but the Americans held their ground. When the native forces withdrew, Harrison's men burned Prophetstown to the ground. Americans celebrated Harrison's victory, though tactically it was nearly a draw. But the battle had wider consequences. Americans found British-made weapons among the ruins, fueling suspicions that Britain was arming native tribes against American settlers. In reality, Britain provided some weapons to their native allies in Canada, but they had not orchestrated Tecumseh's Confederacy. Nevertheless, the belief that Britain was behind frontier violence became another grievance pushing America toward war. In the congressional elections of 1810 to 1811, a new generation of leaders emerged. Young, aggressive Republicans from the South and West. Men like Henry Clay of Kentucky and John C. Calhoun of South Carolina entered Congress demanding a more forceful response to British provocations. They became known as the War Hawks, and they gained control of key committees. Clay was elected Speaker of the House at just 34 years old. The War Hawks saw war with Britain as both necessary and opportunistic. They resented impressment and trade restrictions, but they also saw war as an opportunity to seize Canada, eliminating British power from North America, and to crush native resistance in the Northwest. They believed Canada would fall easily. Jefferson had predicted it would be a mere matter of marching. Through the spring of 1812, Madison came under increasing pressure from the war hawks. On June 1st, 1812, he sent a message to Congress listing American grievances against Britain: impressment of American sailors, violations of American territorial waters, the orders in council that restricted American trade, and support for Native American attacks on the frontier. On June 18, 1812, Congress declared war on Britain. The vote was divided along regional and party lines, 79 to 49 in the House and 19 to 13 in the Senate. It was the closest vote on a declaration of war in American history. New England Federalists, who depended on trade with Britain, opposed the war almost unanimously. Western and Southern Republicans, seeing opportunities for expansion and revenge, supported it enthusiastically. America was going to war again with the world's most powerful nation, just 29 years after winning independence from that same power. It was a war that many believed unnecessary, that the nation was unprepared to fight, and that would come perilously close to destroying the young republic. The final irony was this: unknown to Congress or Madison, the British government had repealed the orders in council on June 16, 1812, 2 days before the American declaration of war. Britain, suffering its own economic problems, had decided to ease restrictions on neutral trade. If transatlantic communication had been faster, the war might never have happened. But the declaration was made, and there would be no turning back. The War of 1812 would test American resolve, threaten its existence, and ultimately help forge a stronger sense of national identity. It would see the burning of the nation's capital, unexpected naval victories, and a final battle fought after peace had already been signed. The founding generation had created a nation through revolution and constitution making. Now a second generation would fight to preserve and expand it. The War of 1812 is sometimes called America's Second War of Independence, and in many ways it was. It would finally establish, beyond doubt, that the United States was a permanent nation, not a temporary experiment that could be undone. The young republic, just 36 years old, was about to face its gravest test since the Revolution itself. Whether it would survive that test remained an open question as American forces, poorly prepared and divided in purpose, marched off to war in the summer of 1812. The founding era was passing into memory, but the work of building and defending the nation it had created continued. And in that continuation, in each generation struggled to preserve and perfect the Union, the founding ideals would be tested, challenged, and renewed. The War of 1812 began with American confidence that bordered on delusion. The war hawks had promised that conquering Canada would be swift and easy. Former President Jefferson predicted the conquest would be accomplished in one campaign. General William Hull, governor of Michigan Territory, issued a proclamation to Canadians promising liberation from British tyranny. But reality would prove far different from these optimistic predictions. The American military was woefully unprepared. The regular army numbered only about 12,000 men, many of them poorly trained and equipped. Officers were often political appointees with no military experience, or aging veterans from the Revolution whose skills had long since faded. The Navy consisted of just 16 ships to face Britain's Royal Navy of over 600 vessels. State militias, crucial to any war effort, were unreliable. Some refused to cross into Canada, claiming their duty was only to defend their own states. The invasion of Canada began disastrously. In July 1812, General Hull led about 2,000 men across the Detroit River into Upper Canada. But after minor skirmishes and hearing exaggerated reports of Native American forces allied with the British, Hull retreated back to Detroit. British General Isaac Brock pursued him with a combined force of about 1,300 British regulars, Canadian militia, and native warriors led by Tecumseh. On August 16, 1812, Brock demanded Hull surrender. When Hull hesitated, Brock's artillery opened fire on Detroit. Hull, terrified of massacre by native forces if the fort was taken by storm, surrendered without a fight. Some 2,500 American soldiers became prisoners of war. The United States had lost Detroit and control of the entire Michigan territory just 1 month into the war. It was a humiliating beginning, but at sea, Americans found unexpected success. The U.S. Navy's frigates, Constitution, United States, and President were superbly built vessels, larger and more heavily armed than their British counterparts. American naval officers were skilled and aggressive. Through the fall of 1812, they won a series of single-ship duels that shocked the British and electrified Americans. On August 19, 1812, the USS Constitution, commanded by Captain Isaac Hull, nephew of the disgraced General Hull, encountered Ichimuscarriere off the coast of Nova Scotia. In a fierce 30-minute battle, Constitution's heavy guns pounded the British frigate into a dismasted wreck. British cannonballs seemed to bounce off Constitution's thick oak sides, earning the ship the nickname Old Ironsides. The Guerriere was so badly damaged that Hull had to sink her. It was America's first significant victory of the war. On October 25, 1812, the USS United States, commanded by Stephen Decatur, captured HMS Macedonian in a battle off the Madeira Islands. Decatur was able to bring the captured ship back to America as a prize, a trophy that lifted American spirits. On December 29, 1812, Constitution struck again, defeating HMS Java off the coast of Brazil. By the end of 1812, the U.S. Navy had won 3 major single-ship victories, while the Army had suffered repeated defeats on land. These naval victories were more symbolic than strategic. Britain's vast fleet could absorb such losses, but they mattered enormously to American morale. They proved that Americans could compete with the world's greatest naval power. They also embarrassed Britain, which had never questioned its naval supremacy. The year 1813 brought mixed results. On the Great Lakes, control of the water determined control of the surrounding territory. In September 1813, Commodore Oliver Hazard Perry achieved a crucial victory on Lake Erie. His small fleet of 9 vessels engaged a British squadron of 6 ships in a brutal, close-range battle near Put-in Bay. Perry's flagship, the Lawrence, was shot to pieces. In the midst of battle, Perry had himself rowed to another ship, the Niagara, and continued the fight. After 3 hours, the British surrendered their entire squadron. Perry sent his famous message to General William Henry Harrison: "We have met the enemy, and they are ours. 2 ships, 2 brigs, 1 schooner, and 1 sloop." The victory gave Americans control of Lake Erie and opened the way for Harrison to invade Upper Canada. Harrison pursued the retreating British and their native allies into Canada. On October 5, 1813, at the Battle of the Thames, Harrison's 3,500 men defeated a combined British and native force of about 1,300. During the battle, Tecumseh, the great Shawnee leader, was killed. His death shattered the native confederacy he had built. Without Tecumseh's leadership and vision, organized native resistance to American expansion in the Northwest effectively ended. But American success in the Northwest was offset by failures elsewhere. An attempt to capture Montreal in the fall of 1813 collapsed when militia refused to cross into Canada. In the Niagara region, American forces burned the Canadian town of Newark in December 1813, leaving hundreds of civilians homeless in winter. The British retaliated by burning the American town of Buffalo on December 30th. The war was becoming increasingly bitter. Everything changed in the spring of 1814. Napoleon was defeated in Europe and forced to abdicate in April. Suddenly, Britain could redirect its full military might against America. Thousands of veteran British soldiers, Wellington's Invincibles who had fought in Spain, were shipped across the Atlantic. Britain prepared a three-pronged offensive: invasion from Canada through New York, a campaign in the Chesapeake Bay region, and an attack on New Orleans. The Northern campaign stalled when a British force of over 10,000 men invaded New York in September 1814, intending to march down Lake Champlain to the Hudson River. But American naval forces under Thomas Macdonough defeated a British fleet on Lake Champlain on September 11, 1814, at the Battle of Plattsburgh. Without naval support, the British Army withdrew back into Canada. The invasion had been stopped, but in the Chesapeake, the British achieved their most spectacular success. In August 1814, a British force of about 4,500 battle-hardened troops under General Robert Ross landed in Maryland and marched toward Washington, D.C. At Bladensburg, just outside the capital, they encountered about 6,000 American militia and sailors on August 24th. The Battle of Bladensburg was a rout. The American militia, poorly trained and led, broke and fled after only brief resistance. The British marched into Washington that evening, virtually unopposed. President Madison and his cabinet had fled to Virginia. First Lady Dolly Madison stayed until the last moment, famously saving a portrait of George Washington before evacuating. That night, British troops set fire to the Capitol, the White House, the Treasury Building, and other government structures. The fires could be seen for miles, lighting the night sky with an orange glow. A thunderstorm eventually helped extinguish the flames. The burning of Washington was Britain's revenge for the American burning of York, modern Toronto, in 1813, but it shocked the world. The young republic's capital lay in ruins. The British then moved on Baltimore, hoping to capture that important port city. On September 12, 1814, as British forces advanced, General Ross was killed by American sharpshooters, one of the few American successes in the campaign. The British bombarded Fort McHenry, which defended Baltimore's harbor, through the night of September 13th to 14th. Francis Scott Key, an American lawyer negotiating prisoner exchanges, watched the bombardment from a British ship in harbor. Through the night, he saw the rockets' red glare, the bombs bursting in air, and wondered whether the fort would survive. At dawn on September 14th, he saw the American flag still flying over the fort, a massive flag measuring 30 by 42 feet. Inspired, Key wrote a poem on the back of a letter, the Star-Spangled Banner. Set to the tune of a popular British drinking song, it would eventually become America's national anthem. The bombardment had failed. Fort McHenry's guns had held the British ships at bay, and the fort's garrison of about 1,000 men had endured. Unable to take the fort or the city, the British withdrew. Baltimore had been saved. While these campaigns unfolded, peace negotiations had begun in Ghent, Belgium. Both sides were exhausted and ready to end the war, though neither would admit it. The American delegation included John Quincy Adams, Henry Clay, and Albert Gallatin, an exceptionally talented team. The British initially demanded harsh terms: American territory in northern Maine and the Northwest, and the creation of an independent Native American buffer state between the United States and Canada. But as negotiations dragged through the fall of 1814, Britain's position weakened. The war was expensive, the British public was tired of decades of warfare, and news of the failed invasions of Plattsburgh and Baltimore suggested the Americans could not be easily conquered. The British dropped their territorial demands. On December 24th, 1814, Christmas Eve, the two sides signed the Treaty of Ghent. Remarkably, the treaty restored everything to the way it had been before the war. All conquered territory would be returned. All prisoners would be exchanged. Not a single issue that had caused the war, impressment, trade restrictions, native rights, was mentioned in the treaty. Both sides simply agreed to stop fighting and return to the pre-war status quo. But news traveled slowly across the Atlantic. In early 1815, neither American nor British forces in America knew that peace had been signed. The most famous battle of the war was yet to be fought, 2 weeks after the treaty was signed, but before anyone in America knew about it. British General Edward Pakenham led approximately 8,000 veteran troops in an assault on New Orleans, defended by General Andrew Jackson with a mixed force of about 4,500 men. Regulars, militia, free black soldiers, pirates, and even some native allies. Jackson had positioned his forces behind earthworks along the Rodriguez Canal, creating a strong defensive position. On January 8, 1815, Pakenham ordered a frontal assault across open ground. It was a catastrophic decision. American artillery and rifle fire cut down the British in waves. Pakenham himself was killed, along with 2 other British generals. In less than 30 minutes, the British suffered over 2,000 casualties, more than 290 killed, over 1,200 wounded, and 500 captured. American losses were approximately 13 killed and 39 wounded. The Battle of New Orleans was the most lopsided victory in American military history to that point. Jackson became a national hero overnight. The victory had no effect on the peace treaty, which had already been signed, but it had enormous psychological impact. Americans believed they had won the war, forcing Britain to make peace. In reality, both sides had fought to exhaustion and settled for a draw. But perception mattered more than reality in shaping national memory. The Treaty of Ghent was ratified by the U.S. Senate on February 16, 1815, formally ending the war. The war had cost approximately 15,000 American lives, most from disease rather than combat, and roughly $158 million. It had nearly bankrupted the government and divided the nation dangerously. New England Federalists had even discussed secession at the Hartford Convention in late 1814. But the war had important consequences. It ended British support for native resistance in the Northwest, opening that region to American expansion. It demonstrated American resolve that the United States would fight to defend its sovereignty. It produced national heroes like Andrew Jackson and Oliver Hazard Perry. It inspired symbols like the Star-Spangled Banner and Old Ironsides. And it marked the final end of the founding era. The last time America fought Britain, the last conflict tied directly to the Revolutionary generation's disputes. Most significantly, the War of 1812 fostered a new sense of American nationalism. Despite the war's military fumbles and political divisions, Americans emerged with renewed confidence. They had survived a second conflict with Britain. They had defended their independence. The United States was no longer a fragile experiment, but an established nation. The founding era, that remarkable period from the first shots at Lexington in 1775 through the War of 1812, was complete. In 40 years, Americans had rebelled against empire, created a new form of government, survived internal divisions, expanded across a continent, and defended their nation in a second war. The republic the founders had created had been tested in fire and had emerged stronger. James Madison left office in 1817, the last president to have signed the Constitution. James Monroe succeeded him, and the nation entered what came to be called the Era of Good Feelings, a period of relative political harmony and optimistic expansion. The founding generation's work was done. What they had built would endure. As the smoke cleared from the War of 1812, America entered a period of transformation. The generation that had fought the Revolution was passing from the stage. Thomas Jefferson retired to Monticello, dedicating his final years to founding the University of Virginia and corresponding with old friends. John Adams lived in quiet dignity in Quincy, Massachusetts, reflecting on the nation he had helped create. James Madison would retire to Montpelier in 1817, the last of the founding presidents. But perhaps the most remarkable story of this transitional period was the reconciliation between John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. These two giants of the founding had been close friends during the Revolution, then bitter political enemies in the 1790s. They hadn't spoken for over a decade. But in 1812, at the urging of mutual friend Benjamin Rush, they began corresponding again. Over the next 14 years, they exchanged 158 letters, a remarkable collection of reflections on politics, philosophy, religion, and the meaning of the revolution they had led. They debated ideas with the same passion they had in their youth, but now with the wisdom of age and the perspective of seeing their republic survive. Adams wrote to Jefferson, "You and I ought not to die before we have explained ourselves to each other." Their letters reveal the doubts and hopes of the founding generation in its twilight. Had they created something lasting? Would their republic survive the challenges ahead? They had witnessed so much: revolution, nation building, partisan strife, war, and survival. Now, in their final years, they could only hope that what they had built would endure. James Monroe's presidency, beginning in 1817, marked what came to be called the Era of Good Feelings. The Federalist Party had collapsed after opposing the War of 1812, leaving Monroe's Democratic Republicans as the only national party. In the election of 1820, Monroe received all but one electoral vote, 231 out of 232, the closest anyone besides Washington came to unanimous election. But this apparent harmony masked new tensions that would eventually tear the nation apart. Still, Monroe's administration achieved something lasting in foreign policy. By the early 1820s, most of Spain's colonies in Latin America had won independence, creating new republics throughout Central and South America. European powers, particularly the Holy Alliance of Russia, Prussia, and Austria, discussed helping Spain reconquer these territories. Monroe and his Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams, decided to take a stand. On December 2nd, 1823, Monroe delivered his 7th annual message to Congress, including what would become known as the Monroe Doctrine. He declared that the Americas were no longer open to European colonization, and that any European attempt to interfere with nations in the Western Hemisphere would be viewed as a hostile act against the United States. It was a bold statement from a nation that still lacked the military power to enforce it. Britain's Royal Navy, more than American might, actually ensured that European powers didn't intervene in Latin America. But the Monroe Doctrine established a principle that would shape American foreign policy for 2 centuries: that the United States had a special interest in and responsibility for the Western Hemisphere. But the domestic challenge that emerged in Monroe's presidency revealed the deepest fault line in American society: slavery. In 1819, Missouri applied for admission to the Union as a slave state. This triggered a crisis that threatened to tear the nation apart. At the time, the Union consisted of 11 free states and 11 slave states, maintaining a careful balance in the Senate. Missouri's admission as a slave state would tip that balance. Representative James Talmadge of New York proposed an amendment requiring Missouri to gradually emancipate its slaves as a condition of statehood. The amendment passed the House but failed in the Senate. The nation erupted in bitter debate. Northerners increasingly viewed slavery as immoral and wanted to prevent its expansion. Southerners saw any restriction on slavery as an attack on their way of life and their constitutional rights. The crisis paralyzed Congress through 1819 and into 1820. Thomas Jefferson, watching from Monticello, wrote that the debate, like a fire bell in the night, awakened and filled me with terror. I considered it at once as the knell of the Union. He recognized that the slavery question, which the founders had sidestepped, might ultimately destroy what they had built. The crisis was resolved through the Missouri Compromise, crafted largely by House Speaker Henry Clay. Missouri would be admitted as a slave state, but Maine, previously part of Massachusetts, would be admitted as a free state, maintaining the balance. More significantly, slavery would be prohibited in all remaining Louisiana Purchase territory north of the 36 degrees 30 minutes parallel, Missouri's southern border, except for Missouri itself. The compromise passed in March 1820, but it satisfied no one. It merely postponed the fundamental conflict over slavery's future. Many in the North resented allowing slavery to expand at all. Many in the South resented Congress presuming to limit where slavery could exist. The Missouri crisis revealed that the Union rested on an unstable foundation, one that might not support the weight of the nation's expansion and growth. And then, on July 4th, 1826, exactly 50 years after the Declaration of Independence was approved, something extraordinary happened. Both John Adams and Thomas Jefferson died on the same day, within hours of each other. Adams, 90 years old, died at his home in Quincy in the early evening. His last words were reportedly, "Thomas Jefferson survives." But Jefferson had died at Monticello that morning, at age 83. The coincidence stunned the nation. That these two men, the primary author of the Declaration and its greatest advocate in Congress, friends and rivals who had shaped the Revolution and the early Republic, should die on the same day, on the 50th anniversary of independence, seemed beyond chance. Many saw it as providential, a sign that their work was complete and blessed. Their deaths marked the symbolic end of the founding generation. James Madison would live until 1836, becoming the last surviving signer of the Constitution. But with Adams and Jefferson gone, the Revolutionary era truly passed into history. The men and women who had experienced British rule, who had risked everything for independence, who had debated the Constitution and launched the Republic, they were disappearing. A new generation was taking their place, one that had grown up in an independent America, that took the Revolution's success for granted, and that faced different challenges. Andrew Jackson would soon transform the presidency, embodying a more democratic and aggressive vision of American power. The nation would continue its relentless expansion westward, displacing native peoples and annexing new territories. The question of slavery would grow increasingly urgent, eventually consuming the nation in civil war. But what had the founding generation accomplished? In just 50 years, from 1776 to 1826, they had achieved something unprecedented in human history. They had overthrown colonial rule and established independence. They had created a written constitution that balanced power, protected rights, and allowed for peaceful change. They had built functioning institutions, Congress, presidency, courts, that worked. They had peacefully transferred power between parties after a contested election. They had survived a second war with Britain. They had expanded from 13 states hugging the Atlantic coast to a nation stretching to the Rockies. Most remarkably, they had proven that people could govern themselves. For centuries, political thinkers had argued that republics were unstable, that only monarchy could provide lasting order. The American experiment had proven otherwise. By 1826, the United States had existed longer than most European observers had predicted it would. But the founding generation also left unfinished business. The contradiction at the heart of the American founding, proclaiming that all men were created equal while enslaving millions, remained unresolved. The treatment of Native Americans, who were steadily pushed from their lands, contradicted claims of justice and morality. Women, who had contributed to the Revolution and early Republic, remained excluded from political participation. The work of making America's ideals reality for all its people would fall to future generations. The Constitution they created was a framework, not a finished product. It was brilliantly designed to be amended, to evolve with changing circumstances. The founders had understood that they couldn't anticipate every challenge, every change that time would bring. So they created a system flexible enough to adapt, while stable enough to endure. The Bill of Rights they added provided powerful protections for individual liberty, but those protections would need to be expanded, clarified, and enforced through generations of struggle. The federal system they created, balancing national and state power, would be tested repeatedly, most devastatingly in the Civil War, when the question of whether states could leave the Union was finally settled through blood and sacrifice. The founding generation's greatest gift wasn't perfection, it was possibility. They gave subsequent generations the tools to continue the work they had begun. The Constitution's amendment process allowed for growth and change. The Bill of Rights provided language that could be invoked in struggles for justice. The democratic institutions they created gave people mechanisms to pursue reform without revolution. Every expansion of rights in American history, the abolition of slavery, women's suffrage, civil rights, voting rights, has been argued in the language of the founding, invoking the principles declared in 1776 and enshrined in 1787. The founders created ideals that were broader than their own ability or willingness to fulfill them. And that gap between ideal and reality has been the engine of American progress ever since. These were human beings, not marble statues. They made mistakes, harbored prejudices, compromised principles, and failed to live up to their own ideals. Washington owned slaves even as he led a revolution for liberty. Jefferson wrote that all men were created equal while keeping human beings in bondage at Monticello. Adams, for all his devotion to freedom, signed the Alien and Sedition Acts. Madison, the Constitution's chief architect, built slavery's protections into the document's core. We can acknowledge their failures while honoring their achievements. We can recognize their blind spots while appreciating their vision. The founding generation created something extraordinary despite their flaws, not because they were perfect. And perhaps that's the most important lesson, that imperfect people can still create institutions and ideals worth preserving, still accomplish things greater than themselves, still leave the world better than they found it. As we reach America's 250th anniversary, we stand at a vast distance from 1776. The nation the founders created has survived civil war, depression, world wars, and countless other challenges. It has expanded across a continent and become a global power. It has slowly, painfully, extended the promise of liberty and equality to more and more of its people. The work continues. The founding was not a moment, but a process, one that began with rebellion in 1775, continued through constitution making in 1787, and extended through the establishment of government, the War of 1812, and beyond. It was the work of thousands of people, soldiers who fought at Yorktown, delegates who debated in Philadelphia, farmers who ratified the Constitution in state conventions, sailors who defended the nation in 1812, and ordinary citizens who believed in the possibility of self-government. They created a nation based on an idea that people possess inherent rights, that government derives its authority from the consent of the governed, that power must be limited and checked, that liberty is precious and worth defending. These ideas were revolutionary in 1776. They remain powerful today. The founders gave us not a perfect union, but the tools to work toward a more perfect one. They gave us not complete freedom, but a framework for expanding freedom. They gave us not finished answers, but enduring questions about how free people should govern themselves. And they gave us an example, however flawed, of what ordinary people can accomplish when they dare to imagine something better and work to make it real. This is the story of America's founding, of revolution and creation, of vision and compromise, of idealism and practical necessity. It's a story of human beings who took enormous risks, made difficult choices, endured terrible hardships, and managed to create something that endured. They launched an experiment in self-government that continues to this day, 250 years later. The work they began is not finished. Each generation inherits the responsibility to preserve what they built while working to fulfill the promises they made. The founding reminds us that change is possible, that ordinary people can shape history, and that the work of creating a more perfect union is never complete. 250 years after independence, the American experiment continues. The founders would surely be amazed by what their nation has become. They might be disappointed by how slowly some of their ideals have been realized, but they would recognize, in the ongoing struggle to live up to those ideals, the continuation of the work they began. This is the legacy of the founding, not perfection achieved, but aspiration established, not a finished monument, but a living promise, not an ending, but a beginning that echoes across the centuries, calling each generation to take up the work of building the nation the founders envisioned but could not fully create. That work continues, and that, perhaps, is the truest measure of their success. This concludes this journey through the history of the founding of the United States, 250th Anniversary Edition. Thank you for listening, and be sure and subscribe and turn on notification so you know when the next journey through history is ready to embark on. Thanks again and have a good night.